Hey everyone, I'm Coach Shippies and I've been a professional top laner or head coach for the past 8 years. During this time I've reached Worlds and MSI multiple times. Now I'm a full-time coach with a ton of passion towards helping players unlock their potential and climb to their dream rank. How's it going everybody? Hope you all had a great Christmas and we are officially back with a Season 14 top lane tier list. Now keep in mind the patch has only been out for a day, so we'll be updating this later on as the season progresses, but this is my opinion on what's stronger and what's weaker on the season, and keep in mind this tier list is for the general player base, not just specifically for high elo, so some champions may be higher or lower depending on what bracket you are, but I will be giving my thought process throughout the entire video of which champion should go where and my reasoning behind it. First on our list, we have Aatrox, and he feels really strong with a Spear of Shojin rush. Of course, there is no mythics in the game anymore, you don't have to rush a mythic. Spear of Shojin into Sundered Skies is your staple build right now, but you can mess around with lethality. I'm going to be experimenting with it later on, and we'll be posting a full build. However, for Aatrox, in terms of his power as a solo queue champion, I will put him in A tier. He's not quite an S tier champion, but I'd say he's high A tier because a lot of his counter matchups in the past, where if you verse a Fiora or a Jayce, you could actually win those matchups, but when they got to their Sunder spike, it would be quite difficult. But now that Sunder is removed from the game, you're going to be fine for basically the whole game in a lot of matchups where you might have struggled in the past. As long as you get yourself a lead in the early game, you don't have to fear that Jack Sunder spike anymore. Even though he can go Triforce and still be quite strong, it's a lot easier to play around a Triforce than a Sunder. Of course, he doesn't have that healing, so I would put Aatrox in A tier because with Sunder being gone, a lot of his counter matchups are a lot easier now. Next up we have Akali, and I'm going to give her quite the promotion. I'm actually going to put her into A tier. I will rearrange all the champions at the end from left to right, but for now I'll just slot them in. And the reason I moved her up to A tier, when in the past I would have had her as a C tier champ, is because now that Sunder is removed, of course a lot of one item spike champions she can beat, but also a lot of the new items are really good on her. She can build Leandros now in tank matchups, where in the past tanks can neutralize Akali quite well, and also Riftmaker feels a bit better, you don't have to build the Leeching Lair, and also Storm Surge. Now this item is really overpowered right now in my opinion, feels really good on Akali, but also the fact that Hullbreaker got nerfed, the point where if somebody built Hullbreaker in the past and you're playing a champion like Akali or Vladimir at an AP top, you're really going to struggle in the side to clear that minion. You're just going to be trapped under your tower, quite useless. But now that the Hullbreaker item, it doesn't really do that anymore, that doesn't make them that tanky, you can actually one-shot them, especially if you're ahead. So the split pushing power against Akali is not quite as high, so the champion can function quite well even as a top laner. Moving on to Akshan, I am going to put him into C tier. He's just not the strongest top laner right now. He can be low B in lower elo brackets, gold and below, but just in general, this champion is not the strongest top laner. Even now that AP items are really strong and you might be seeing a lot more Lilia and Brand jungles, even with those champs, even though you do want an AD top, it's better to have a bit of an AD bruiser top, but a frontline, a bit of beef, some CC. So Akshan doesn't really have a good place in this meta either, in my opinion. He's quite good mid, I would say, right now on this patch, but as a top laner, I would say he's around C tier. Up next we have Camille, and I have a theory that Riot's going to be buffing Camille in the next couple patches, and I really hope so, because she's really going to struggle on this one. Because right now there's no Divine Sunderer, and also the way the top lane terrain is built right now, it's really hard to hit easy on your opponent or Illaoi in certain matchups depending on where the wave is, and she's just really going to struggle, especially now that Triforce will be your main mythic, but the build path is quite painful. Sheen is now 1000 gold, very hard to get that on your first recall, so Camille is going to be B tier. I'm not going to put her lower than B tier because she's still Camille, still one of the best scaling tops in the game, insane engage. As long as you get through your laning phase, you're going to be fine. It's just a lot harder to do so now. As for Cassiopeia, I am going to put her into B tier, quite similar to before. However, now that Sunder is removed, she is going to have a bit of a better time into matchups like Jax and Fiora. Even though she did win those matchups in the past, now at the one item spike it is going to be a bit easier for you. So she will be a bit higher in B tier, but still B tier overall. And the new item changes feel quite good on her, and even the new map, I will talk about it later on. But it's a lot harder to be ganked, I'd say, on the new terrain for top lane. So Cassio is actually going to be a bit better as a lane bully as well. Moving on to Cho'gath, and he's going to find himself in D tier. Now, even though the new tank items are quite good, and you will get quite beefy on him, he's still extremely immobile, one of the most vulnerable champs in the game in top lane in my opinion. Really easy to gank or even really easy to solo kill from a lot of champions. Yone, Gwen, a lot of champs can just run you down. Aatrox, really hard for you to basically stop them from doing what they want to do. League's evolved to the point where everyone can dodge Cho'gath Q, I'd say, for the most part, so it's really hard for you to survive in a lot of matchups. Of course, if you verse some noobs who just push you wave after wave and let you farm up, you will become a beefcake later on. So the champ's not useless by any means, he's still quite strong in teamfights. Just in general, he is a D tier champ because it's really hard to have a good performance in the early game, and that's so important right now. Moving on to Darius, who's going to find himself in A tier. Now, he will be a bit lower in the A tier list as he would have been in the past. That's just because now they've removed ability haste from Stridebreaker, so it feels a lot worse on him overall compared to in the past, but he's still really strong, he's still Darius, he is still going to run you down the lane if you can get a free, so he's still quite powerful as a solo queue champ, just not as strong as he was in the past. Moving on to Dr.Mundo, and the Doctor is going into C tier. I would put him in B tier if this was a low elo tier list, of course. This champion is quite good at stomping noobs, at just running them down, running down the backline, but that doesn't really work in higher elo brackets. And this champion, even though the tank items are quite nice, still has the same problems as the past, and also you're quite weak early game. So you're not really going to be able to fight for the grubs early on, so this champion still keeps himself in C tier. Now, moving on to Fiora, a lot of you are going to be quite happy to see this, but she's going to get her first demotion in many seasons, I'd say. She's going down into A tier, and my reason for that is now that Sunder is removed, of course, she doesn't really have that many options for a starting item, a first item. You do have to rush Ravenous Hydra a lot of times, or even Triforce, but the Triforce build path is so horrible. 1k for Sheen is really going to be hard to get as Fiora in certain matchups, and also the way the meta is going to change a lot. You're going to see a lot of champions like Rumble in top lane, who Fiora struggles against, and also she doesn't really have that insane Hull Breaker 1v3 angle later on anymore, unless she gets really fed, of course, and this champion is still extremely powerful, don't get me wrong. And if you're a really good Fiora player, you can carry the majority of your games. It's just compared to how strong she was in the past, right now with the way the items in the meta is looking, she's not going to be as strong as she was. Up next we have Garen, and Garen is going to be barely into A tier, I would say. In lower elo brackets, I would say Platinum and below, he is probably S tier, let's be real. This champion is really powerful. The problem is on the new patch, now that Stridebreaker not only does it not have ability haste, you also can't build Iron Spike Whip, which means you can't pop your phase rush with it, so it's a lot harder to pop your phase, so this champion is weaker on this patch than in the previous season. However, because he's Garen, he's really easy to execute, he scales really well, really easy to farm. The champion is always going to be good in solo queue, it's just right now, if you try to play him, I'd say Diamond and above, you would struggle, and maybe even in Emerald he's not going to be as good. Moving on to Gnar, who in my opinion is the middle of the pack top laner. I'll probably try to put him into the middle of B tier because this champion is just really powerful at certain points in the game and extremely weak in other parts. So in the early game especially, he is quite weak, very vulnerable, and it's really easy to shut him down. But if you can avoid the 1-3 in a lot of bad matchups, or even getting punished from the first jungle path, you can scale quite well, especially once you have Triforce as a one-item spike. This champion is really, really strong in side lane especially. You can really look to blow up your tower in a lot of matchups 1v1 if you have really high mastery. Problem is this champion is just so weak early game, and now that grubs are in the game especially, you're not really going to be that strong around them. It's going to be hard to time your mega for a 5-minute grub fight, for example, and it's just really hard to execute, I would say. This champion just can't be too strong, otherwise it'd be ridiculous in pro play, but in terms of a solo queue champion, I would put him as a middle of the pack champ, around the middle of B tier. Up next we have Gangplank, and GP is going to be in B tier. He didn't really benefit that much from the new patch, from the new items. The main benefit he got is that you can farm the grubs with your barrels and get quite a lot of extra gold, but that means you have to be winning topside, and if you're winning it 5 minutes into the game as GP, your lane opponent's doing something very wrong, and now that the fact that Sheen is 1k gold, that's going to be really hard for you to get that on your first buy. The only reason I'm not demoting him into C tier, it's just because he's GP. From level 13 onwards, you are a machine. You can 1v9 later on to the game, and if you have really high mastery on this champion, you're still going to be very strong. So in general, the champion, I would say, sits in B tier, but if you have really high mastery on him, you could creep into A tier, I would say. It depends on your elo bracket, but in general, I would say he sits into B tier. Moving on to Gragas, and I think this champion is extremely overpowered in Season 14, so I'm going to be putting him into S tier. If you're playing in lower elo brackets, maybe he's going to be B or A, but in higher elo games, Emerald and above, I'd say, this champion is going to be extremely powerful. Now, he doesn't really have any bad matchups. You can blind pick him and you're going to be fine. Worst case scenario, you're just going to Q farm from far away, and this champion uses the new items extremely well. Notably, Storm Surge feels extremely good on him. It makes your damage feel a lot higher. Where in the past, even AP Gragas, if you watch a bit of pro play, they would build Everfrost and be more of a utility Gragas build as opposed to a full AP one-shot montage build. But now with the new items, you have so many options. You can go either way, I would say. But especially the Storm Surge build, even with Illudens as a first item, feels extremely strong on this champ. And I would say, for now, unless they nerf the AP items, he is going to be S tier in a lot of your games. Moving on to Gwen, and she's going to find herself in A tier. She feels extremely good on this patch. Now, even though she doesn't use many of the new AP items, you still build Riftmaker and Nash's most of the time. Riftmaker feels a lot better with the new build path, going Haunting Guides instead of Leeching Lair, feels a lot nicer. And also the removal of Sundra means a lot of your harder matchups in the past, notably Jax and Camille and Fiora, now they don't really have Sundra, so once they have that one item spike, you're still going to be able to actually beat them, and you don't really have to take Ignite, which is better because that means you can take Ghost, which is a lot better for you in team fights, and I think this champion is going to be really strong for this season. Moving on to Illaoi, and this season I'm going to demote her into B tier. Now, keep in mind, even though Iceborne is 400 gold cheaper, that is a lot nicer for Illaoi. This season you're going to see a lot more AP tops in my opinion. Champions like Rumble, Vlad, and Gwen are going to be a lot stronger, and Illaoi is really going to struggle into AP champs, because you can't really rush an Iceborne into a full AP champ. You're going to be wasting all your gold on armor, and now you don't have that option to pivot into Sundra, so Illaoi is going to have a lot more counter picks this season, which is good because that champion feels horrible to play against. But as a champion, if you counter somebody with Illaoi, it's still going to be really powerful. It is still Illaoi in solo queue, hit 1E, win the lane. So this champion is still good. He's not a lot worse, I'd say, just slightly worse enough to drop into B tier. Up next we have Irelia, and Irelia is going to be an A tier. She is quite a powerful solo queue champion, and she is going to be stronger than she was last season, because now, of course, Sundra being removed, she doesn't have to play into Sundra champs, and also she has a lot more options now, where in the past, once you finished your Bork, your build was kind of done, but now you have quite a lot of choices. You have a lot of on-hit attack speed items that you can choose from, and also the fact that Wit's End gives tenacity. So even if you verse an AD champion in lane, you build your plated steel caps, you can still get tenacity later on. I think she's really going to benefit from the new items. She's going to be quite strong, and she does have potential to be S tier, and I do need to have a lot more data on her before I make that claim, I would say. But in general, I would say she's going to be A tier in most elo brackets. Up next we have Jax, who's going to be keeping his place up in S tier. This champion is just one of the best solo queue top laners in the game. His kit is just very powerful for carrying games in solo queue, and even though you don't have Divine Sundra anymore, this champion has still quite a powerful laning phase, great scaling, great side laning. He just does too many things well in game, and also it's not like you don't really have any choices anymore. Triforce still feels quite good on Jax, even though the build paths are quite hard to get to 1k for Sheen. It's easier to get a Sheen on Jax than a champion like Camille, for example, because your lane phase is so strong. And also keep in mind, Jax, a lot of the new items he can actually use, the attack speed on hit ones as well, and especially Wit's End giving tenacity, he is going to benefit a lot from the new changes, especially the grubs giving him damage to tower. So even though he lost his Sundra, he got a lot of other benefits in response. Moving on to Jayce, and if this was a challenger only tier list, I would put him into S tier, but because it's for all elo brackets, I will put him in A tier, because if you try to play this champion in platinum or below, I would say you're going to struggle, unless you have a lot of mastery on this champ, but on this new patch he's going to feel quite powerful. And I might sound like a broken record now, but Sundra being gone and whole breaker being nerfed means champions that didn't build those items are going to be stronger in general, and also Jayce uses a lot of the new lethality items quite well, so this champion is going to feel really strong on the new season. Moving on to Kayle, and I am going to drop her into D tier. She is close to being C, I would say, because she just scales so well. The problem with Kayle is she's really terrible early game, as you all may know. She's very vulnerable to ganks, and you're just going to be giving over the early grubs. It's going to be very easy for the enemy jungle top to play for grubs and just get their free objective, which is going to help the whole team. So Kayle in general on this patch is going to be slightly weaker, I'd say, but of course, because she's one of the better scaling champs in the game, she still has a place as a counterpick. Now, in regards to Kennen, I am going to put him into really high B tier, even though Bob Jenkins did get 2000 LP with this champion. He is just one guy, and in general in solo queue, this champion is not the strongest unless you're in high elo games. I'd say he's very good in high elo, but in lower elo games he's not as good, because it's very hard to toe that line between playing very aggressive and rangeless melee matchups and also not giving a kill over to the enemy jungler. And also the problem with Kennen and lower elo games is that he doesn't really quite have that carry potential that a strong bruiser champion like Gwen or Fiora or Jax will have, where they can sort of, I wouldn't say 1v5, but they can just force a carry situation to play out if they get a lot of resources. With Kennen, you have to play around your ulti, you have to play really well in team fights, where it's a lot more team reliant, I would say, than other champions that are above him in the list. But with the new items, he feels very powerful, especially Storm Surge. So in high elo brackets, I'd say Diamond above, this champion's going to feel really good. Moving on to Kled. Now, last season Kled was quite weak. Now he's even weaker. This champion is just terrible in my opinion. A lot of the bruiser items lost their CDR, and also he lost Gore Drinker, so this champion doesn't really have a ton of options for a first item. Maybe a Kennen one trick will surprise me with a really unique build, and he might be a C or B tier, maybe, depends how the build looks. But in general right now, just looking through all the items, I can't imagine this champion being higher than D tier, unless you're in lower elo brackets. The champion's quite good at stomping lower elo players, I'd say gold and below, but in general this champion is not going to be very good on this patch. Moving on to Cassante. Now he's going to slot into B tier. Now he is stronger on this patch, with Iceborne being cheaper and a lot of tankier items being stronger, especially MR items. This champion is going to be quite powerful. The problem is his skill mastery, his skill ceiling, is so high. It's really hard to get the most out of this champion, where he is mainly a high elo champion, I would say. So in general for solo queue, he is going to slot around B tier, but the higher elo the better. Moving on to Malphite, and I am going to put him into A tier. This champion just has one of the best ease of executions in the game. His kit is always reliable. Even if you're down 200 CS, you lost your tower, the champion's always useful. You've probably experienced that if you ever versed a autofill Malphite player. The champion is still good. And on the new patch, there are a lot of good MR items, which is really nice for Malphite because in the past, or even now, you get hard countered by AP champs. So it's not going to change. It's just going to be a lot nicer for you to scale into later points of the game with MR items. The problem with Malphite now is that there's probably going to be a lot more Rumble and Vlad and Gwen players, I would say, who Malphite's going to very much struggle against. However, because this champion is so easy to play and always useful in the game, he's still an A tier solo queue pick. Moving on to Maokai, and I actually think Maokai is going to be a little bit better this patch. He's going to be in C tier, and that's just because Sunder is being removed. A lot of the strong bruiser items with CDR like Gore Drinker gone as well. So there's a lot less sustain in top lane, and he's quite a good sustain tank. So if you're versing a champion such as Jax, for example, and you get a good trade onto him, he's not just going to whack you with 2 Ws and heal it back. It's going to be a lot easier for you to win matchups like that, and he might even be B tier. I'll have to see a bit more data on him, but this champion is going to be a lot stronger in the season regardless, and the new items do feel quite good on him as well. Moving on to Mordekaiser, who's going to slot his way up into B tier. He's got a promotion as well, and you can probably guess the reason. Sundra being removed is so huge for Mordekaiser. It's going to allow him to win a lot more 1v1s in the death realm, and also the new itemization options are really great for him, where he didn't really have an item that felt amazing on him in the previous seasons. He didn't have this one build that felt great on him. But now he's got so many options, depends what you're up against. You can go a high damage build or a tankier build. I'm going to have to experiment a bit more on him, but this champion I can see him being a lot stronger on this season. Up next we have Nasus, who's going to find himself in C tier. The removal of Sundra is going to hurt him, and also the early grub fights are not going to be very useful, I'd say. You need time to scale, so this champion is not going to be the strongest on this patch. The only reason he's not D tier is because he's quite a monster in lower elo brackets, so he gets a bit of promotion for that. Now, as for Olaf, they've kind of massacred my boy. He's still in A tier, don't get me wrong. He's still a very powerful solo queue champ with a ton of carry potential. It's just a lot of the new items feel not as good on him. Not having ability haste on Olaf is quite tragic. You really need haste on this champion, so it's quite hard to itemize and get haste at the same time as getting strong items, I'd say. So he is weaker, but the way his kit is built, of course, really powerful in lane. You can chase down your opponents, can get solo kills very easily, and also, if you get ahead, it's very easy to play out team fights, right? You can just run them down. So this champion's still very powerful in solo queue. He's just weaker than in the past, but also the removal of Sundra means it sort of balances out a bit. So all the matchups you're playing in the past, where if you've versed a Jax or a Fiora or a Camille, champs that are really good when they have Sundra, it's not quite as bad when they have Triforce for you to win the 1v1, because they're not just going to be vamping down your damage and, trying to cut you out. Moving on to Ornn, and Ornn's going to find himself in A tier. He's going to fare quite well on this patch, with the removal of Sundra and also Hullbreaker being weaker. He's going to have a lot of a better time. And even though he does get countered really hard by certain AP champions, MR items are quite strong right now, so even if you're versing Gwen or a Mord, you are going to be fine, and this champion is going to be very powerful, especially around these early grub fights. I'll just look out, because this is a solo queue tier list. He's not the strongest solo queue champion, even though he's an A tier, but he's an extremely powerful blind pick. There's not that many difficult matchups, especially now with the new itemization, so he's really good at that, but I wouldn't really be wasting 5 pick on red, for example, to pick Ornn, unless your team comp really needed a tank. Moving on to Pantheon, he's going to keep his place in A tier. This champion is quite powerful in solo queue. He is a bit weaker on this patch, with Eclipse being terrible, doesn't give lethality anymore. However, you do have quite a few lethality options, but I will say, if you're fighting somebody that's going to be fighting you back, such as Irelia or Fiora, these new lethality items are not as good as Eclipse in terms of pure 1v1 power, so he's not as good in that regard, but he's still extremely powerful, really hard to deal with, especially for the first, 1 to 5, really strong in lane, and he's going to be strong at those grub fights as well, so he's still going to be a good champion in solo queue overall. Moving on to Poppy, and I'm going to be putting her in B tier. She's got a bit of a demotion. I would have put her in A tier in the past, but now that you don't have the option to skill into Sundra, if you wanted to in certain matchups, or if you're snowballing, she's basically stuck into being a full tank champion, I'd say, which is fine. The problem is she's a tank without a ton of threat. You can't really look to throw in the backline like you could on a champion like Malphite. You don't really have engage. There's sort of a champion built for peeling, which in solo queue, as you probably may know, if your bot lane is playing terribly, you don't really want to be peeling for them, so you're quite limited in your options in certain games. So that's why she's quite an average champion, which is why I put her in B tier. Up next we have Quinn, who I will be putting in B tier. Now her identity is still the same. In solo queue, you are just a really strong counter pick. You would never really blind pick this champion, but a lot of the new lethality items will feel quite good on her, so she does have a place, especially as a counter pick. And if you're winning your lane quite handily, it's very easy for your jungler to get the grubs. So this champion is going to be decent as a counter, but in general her place is going to remain the same as last season. Now, as for Renekton, I am actually going to put him in B tier. I'm going to give him a bit of a demotion. I feel like a lot of the new item changes actually hurt Renekton. You might think Sundra being removed is good for him, which of course that aspect is, but you can't really build Gore Drinker anymore. Of course, that's removed, and a lot of the Bruiser items don't have ability haste, which is really good on Renekton. So he really struggles with the new itemization changes, and also basically, all the other champs benefit more from it. So historically into Renekton, champions that are tanks are really good into him, and the tank items are quite strong now, and also Rumble's quite good into him. Of course, AP items are stronger. So a lot of champions that you would be picking into Renekton are just stronger in general, so he's going to struggle a bit more, and he doesn't quite have that power as he did in the past at one item, because you're not really going to have any ability haste, that Gore Drinker active, anything like that. So for that reason, he's going to be in B tier, but he's not terrible, and in lower elo brackets, he is going to be quite strong as well, especially for grub fights. So I wouldn't completely remove him from your champion pool if you like playing this champ. It's just, in my opinion, he's not going to be quite as A tier powerful as champions like Gwen or Fiora as he was in previous patches. Moving on to Rengar, who also gets a bit of a demotion, going to put him in B tier. Now, the reason for that is there's no Sunder, and also Eclipse is terrible, which were the two main items you would see from top lane Rengar. So I don't really see the best item for him right now. Of course, the one tricks are going to figure it out, but in general, looking through all the lethality and the bruiser items, there's no item that jumps out that's going to be very powerful on him. So in my opinion, he's going to be weaker on this patch. So now we have another champion joining S tier, and that is going to be Riven. This champion's going to be very powerful on this patch, and in my opinion needs a nerf, because the new item change is going to help her a lot, especially Sundra being removed. All of the really common top lane matchups you'd play in the past, such as Fiora or Jax, they don't really have Sundra anymore, of course, so those matchups are going to be way easier. And also the new itemization, even though the lethality is removed from Eclipse, you don't really build that anymore. Rushing Spear of Shojin on Riven feels quite powerful, looks really strong, and she has a ton of options. The lethality Hydra as well, you could build that depending on the game state, depending on what champion you're up against. So this champion has a lot of options, looks very powerful, and has a ton of 1v9 potential, so in my opinion it's going to be S tier in most elo brackets. Up next we have Rumble, who is one of the champions I was most excited about on this patch, and I'm going to put him in A tier for this tier list. However, keep in mind, if this was a higher elo tier list, he would be in S tier. I think this champion is extremely powerful, really strong. The problem with him in lower elo brackets is the games go for a lot longer in lower elo games, and also there are a lot more mistakes, where if you're playing a champ like Rumble, we have an insane early game strength, I'd say, really powerful laning phase, you have to play quite well a low mistake playstyle, which is not really going to happen in lower elo brackets. But with the new items, he feels so powerful, and again, Hullbreaker Sunder being removed, I'll say it again and again, he benefits from that as well, but especially the new items, Storm Surge especially, that item's overpowered, really good on Rumble, and Liandry's as well, being able to rush that as a first item. Just so many items are great on this champion, and he's going to be overpowered. The only reason I'm not putting him in S tier is for the lower elo games. I'd say Platinum and below are going to struggle playing this champ. Now, as for Sejuani, I would say she's a D tier champion. You can cheese a lot of matchups with TP Ignite or get a lot of ganks if you have an AD jungle that auto attacks like Viego, but in general, as a solo queue champion, she's not that strong. Her team fighting's not that great, her laning's not that great if you're ahead, if you're even, sorry, unless you're ahead. She's just pretty solid at being a tank, but not that useful, I'd say. She doesn't have that impact that an Ornn or a Malphite would have in terms of a tank, or even that lane power that a laning champ like Cassante would have, that kill threat. She's quite good as a champion that you duo with your jungler and make the enemy top laner miserable, I'd say. If you play, like I said, Viego Sejuani, really easy to camp top. But in general, I'd say she's a D tier champion, even though the new items are quite good on her. Moving on to Set, and Set's going to find himself in B tier. Even though Gore Drinker being removed might hurt him, Sundra being removed is going to help him a bit more. He will struggle in a lot of these AP matchups, I would say, such as Rumble or a really good Kennen player. But in general, this champion is quite solid in what he does, what he provides to a team comp. And if you take Ignite, especially in your lane, you can solo kill a lot of melee matchups. This champion has a lot of 1v1 power. And you might have to rush Spear of Shojin now instead of Gore Drinker, but that's still going to be fine. So in general, I'd say this champion's going to sit around B tier. Moving on to Shen, who I am going to be putting in D tier. He's not going to be that valuable in early grab fights. Of course, the point of Shen is to ulti bottom and create numbers advantage. The problem with Shen always lies in the fact that when you ulti away, you are going to lose plates, and you can't really get prio in a lot of matchups, so it's very hard to get good ulti times without losing a lot in top lane. So in terms of a solo queue champion, I just think this champion sits around D tier, but if you're playing flex queue with your boys, Clash, maybe amateur tournaments, of course he is going to be a bit stronger, but as a solo queue champion, he sits around D tier. Now as for Shyvana, I'm just going to put her straight in D tier. I probably have a personal bias against this champion. I just think it is completely useless, doesn't provide anything to a team comp. So even with the new items, that's not really going to change that. There's no standout item that she can buy anyway, and the early grub fight, she's going to be useless. There's no meta change that's going to favor him. If she versus a Rumble, she's still going to get wrecked, or a Gwen. Doesn't really change much, so I would say she stays in D tier. Moving on to Sinjin, I will be putting him in B tier. I think he's quite a solid solo queue champion. If you can get a proxy situation where you get past your lane opponent and you're proxying, you're in their jungle, you're trying to attack their mid laner, of course you're probably versus Sinjin has done that. It can feel very hard to play against, and with the new terrain, it is a lot harder to get into that proxy situation, I would say, so he is slightly lower in the B tier ranking than I'd have him in the past, because it's hard to get to that initial proxy position. However, the ability to build Liandry's now, that you can Liandry's Rylai's combo, is going to feel quite good on him. So I'd say he's going to sit around B tier, good itemization, but the map changes are going to hurt him slightly. Now, as for Sion, I will be putting him into A tier. He's close to being in B, I would say. I think he's just going to benefit extremely well from the new tank items and Sundra being removed, so he's going to find himself into A tier. And also, even versing champions like Darius or Olaf, even though those matchups are quite difficult, they can't build haste early on anymore, so it's going to be a lot easier for you to deal with them, play around their cooldowns. So I'll say this champion's going to have a lot better time in the season. Now, as for Tahm Kench, I will be putting him into C tier. This champion just doesn't provide a lot to a team comp. It feels like a champ where you have to get ahead in lane phase, where you're completely useless. However, it is quite strong in lane, especially versus melee champions without a ton of escapes, so it can be a very powerful counter pick. And in terms of the new items, there's not a lot of change for him, I'd say. He is going to be a bit tankier later on, but he's still going to have that same problem where if you don't snowball in your laning phase, you're going to be completely useless. Moving on to Teemo, and he's going to be in B tier. This champion is quite good in lower elo brackets, really hard to deal with in lane if you're not an experienced laner, if your wave control is not on point. But in higher elo games, he is still going to have the same problem. He has a lot of very difficult counter picks, and even though the fact that you can build Liandry's with a nice build path on him means he's going to have a lot more damage into tanks, he's still going to struggle into surviving enemy junglers when you verse high elo players. So in general, I'd say this champion sits around B tier, but I would say the lower elo game you're in, the better. Moving on to Trundle, and I will be putting him into A tier. He didn't really build Sundra anyway, you always build Trifle, so that's going to be fine for him. Even though the change to Hullbreaker may hurt him a little, keep in mind tank items are a lot stronger, tanks are going to be tankier now, so the benefit you gain from your ulti is actually going to increase, and also if you can get some early grubs on this champion, your damage to towers is just going to be insane, even higher than last season, so I think this champion is still going to be very powerful. Up next we have Tryndamere. I'm going to be putting him in B tier. He's still going to be a solid solo queue champion. He's going to have a lot of split push angles, of course, very strong in side lane. The problem lies he doesn't really benefit that much from the new changes. Of course, if your team can get some grubs, it's going to help him a lot in terms of breaking down towers, but the Hullbreaker nerf is going to hurt him, and also there's no real new crit items that you're going to build on him that are going to feel significantly more powerful, I would say. So he doesn't really get a boost of power. But Sundra being removed, of course, is good for him, but of course he is hurt a bit with that Hullbreaker nerf. Now, as for Udyr, I do think this champion is quite underrated, so I will be slotting him into A tier. I think in really high elo games, he's not that useful, but in lower elo games, he can be quite a menace. Very easy to get ahead in laning phase against someone that doesn't know how to play against Udyr, get into a proxy position, and really start to take over the map. And you can get extremely tanky with these new items. It can be very hard to kill a fed Udyr, especially on this new patch. So I feel like he's going to benefit a lot, and you are quite strong for these early grub fights. So he's going to have a bit of more of a place in the season, and he's also quite good into Rumble, who I think is going to be rising in popularity. So Udyr is also going to be a good counter pick for him as well. Up next we have Urgot, who's going to be another D tier champion. He's not going to be that strong on this patch, even though the new Titanic Hydra might be good on him. He's going to struggle into the really strong AP champs such as Gwen, Rumble, even Akali. If they're good at laning, he's not really going to have a good time into them. And even tanks are going to do a lot better into him now because they can build a lot tankier items for cheaper, especially Iceborne. So it's going to be a bit harder for Urgot to really find his place in this meta, I would say. But of course, if he gets fed, he can get rolling. Of course, the champion can be useful. The problem is getting to that point consistently. Moving on to Vayne, and I will be putting Vayne into B tier. She's quite similar to Quinn in the sense where she's a very good counter pick, and the place I'd be using Vayne, if you had her in your champ pool and you're not a Vayne one trick, if you just like to use her as a counter, is into really beefy neutralizer champs. So what I mean by neutralizers are champs like Udyr or Volley or Tahm Kench, where they don't really do that much unless they're ahead. They're quite strong in lane, but it's very hard for them to force any advantage onto you. Now, let's say, for example, you're playing Jax versus Tahm. You're quite happy to go even in that lane because you know you're going to be more useful. But if you play Vayne into a Tahm or a Udyr, something like that, you can get quite a significant lead on them in the early game, and then you outscale them later on to the game. So those are the matchups where Vayne is really good. The reason I don't like her as much into champs like Ornn, for example, is because it's not necessary that you're going to be a lot more useful than them later on to the game, right? They're a tank, they're a frontline, they have hard engage for their team, and also it's very easy for them to set up ganks on you, where if you're versing Udyr, the worst he's going to do is pop Ghost and run towards you, where you're just going to pop your own Ghost. So I would say Vayne is a really solid counter pick and I would put him in B tier. Moving on to Vladimir. Now, I will be putting Vlad in B tier. I'm very close to putting him in A. The only reason I didn't do so is because even though he's a lot stronger with these new items, Storm Surge and Protobelt 2 Item Spike will be very good on him. Storm Surge especially, really powerful item. It's still, you have to get to that point. And Grubs being in the game means you being weak early game is going to matter significantly. Of course, if you're in a counter matchup where you're bullying your lane, if you do the Ignite Ghost tech especially, and you're in a good lane, of course you can win your lane and be useful for that point. And in that case, of course, you'd be really strong. But in general, if you're picking Vlad every game, you're going to verse some hard counter matchups such as Irelia or Yone, where they're going to bully you down. They're going to be stronger than you at the Grub fights. So it's going to be hard for you to get to that point where you're a raid boss. However, because Sunder and Hullbreaker are not as annoying anymore, of course Sunder being gone, he is a lot stronger. He is a viable option now, where in previous seasons he wasn't. So he is going to be a good champion to add to your pool if you love playing this champ as a counter pick. But in terms of a champ you pick every game, he's going to struggle a bit because he's weak early game, and also because AP junglers are so powerful. And you really don't want to be playing Vlad with a Lilia or a Brand. Even today, I was trying to play Vlad all day, but I just had an AP jungler or a really heavy AP comp every time, even AP bots. So it's really hard to pick this champion whenever you want. So as a counter pick, he's going to be extremely powerful, and that's why I would put him in around B tier, because even though he's really good when he's good, he's not going to be as good as often as you'd like. Up next we have Volibear, and I'm going to be putting him in C tier. This champion's just a neutralizer, where it's pretty hard to force a meaningful advantage on your opponent, unless he makes a huge mistake himself, which is why in lower elo games he can be good, but this is a champion where the higher elo you go, the less useful you're going to be, and the new items don't really benefit him that much anyway, so I'd say in general this champion is going to sit around C tier. Now, as for Warwick, I'm going to be putting him in C tier. He actually got worse this season, in my opinion, because Sunder is being removed and you don't really have a great alternative that suits your champion's identity. You don't really want to be rushing Bork on Warwick and being very squishy, and in my opinion, it's going to be the same champion, where only the one tricks that take barrier exhaust are going to play him, and just be this really annoying neutralizer similar to a Volibear, but now that Sunder is removed, you have a lot less power at one item. Moving on to Yasuo, who's going to be still in C tier. Even though Sunder is removed, you're still going to get beat down by any bruiser or range champ or even tank. There's not really, a good place for him in top lane, maybe as a Gnar counter pick or something like that, but in general this champion is mainly for mid players that get filled, I'd say. Now moving on to Yone, who in my opinion is probably the strongest top laner in the game, and I'm going to be putting him in the S tier. I think this champion is just ridiculously broken, and I was hoping that the new item changes would make him a bit weaker, but in my opinion that's just not the case. He's still really powerful. He actually has more options now from itemization. You can go Iceborne if you want some games, you can rush Bork, you can go Kraken, depending on your matchup, depending on the game, you have a few more options now, but this champion is still extremely powerful if you can pilot him well, and in my opinion the best top laner right now. Moving on to Yorick, who I will be putting into B tier. I'd probably put him in A tier last season. The reason I'm putting him in B is because of the Hullbreaker nerf. This is going to hurt him quite a lot, and also the fact that Eclipse is quite terrible. That's not really an option anymore. And this champion doesn't really have the option to ever teamfight. He's not really like a Jax, where if you're losing side lane, of course you can always perform well in a team fight, or even if you're winning side lane, you can carry team fights at one item or two items. Yorick never really has that option unless you're 10-0 or something, it doesn't really matter. In general, that champion is only good at side laning, and they made it so Hullbreaker, you don't get those resistances anymore. It's very easy to 1v2 Yorick now compared to as it was in the past. And for our last champion, we have Zac, and I'm going to be putting him into B tier. He's going to benefit quite a lot from the item changes. The new tank items are great on him, and also Sundra being removed and Hullbreaker being nerfed. I'll say it yet again, the last time I promise. That's going to benefit him a lot because in the past, Zac has really good sustain, right, with his passive. So if you're fighting a champion like Jax or Camille or something, of course, if you play a long fight and you play it quite well, picking up your blobs, you know, dodging CC, buffering Jaxi, stuff like that, you can win those fights. But once Jax has a Sundra, I'll just say to Jax for now, he's just going to beat you down and just vamp back all your damage. You can't really do any meaningful damage onto him in the side lane unless you're already ahead from laning phase, which is quite hard to do on Zac. It's hard to force an individual advantage, but now if you scale evenly against those champs, you're going to be strong enough to deal with them inside and outperform them in team fights. Alright everyone, I'm going to call it there, and feel free to let me know down below in the comments what you'd like to see me cover next, because I'm going to be covering a ton of concepts on this new season. I've been holding out a lot of things I wanted to teach you guys until the changes, so please feel free to let me know what champion you'd like to see me cover or which concept, and I'll see what I can do. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time.